Hello everyone and welcome to All Things Watched. In this video we are going to talk about episode 3 or part 3 of True Detective season 4, also known as True Detective Night Country. Now this episode was really interesting because they really did something that I was not expecting, which is they really leaned heavily into the supernatural realm of this series, and that actually caught me off guard a little bit. I wasn't expecting them to go this much further into the supernatural. If you've been following my previous reviews, I have been saying how I really liked how they've been utilizing the supernatural aspects of people, being able to see the dead, maybe even talk to the dead. But in this episode, they really go full blown into like real supernatural, into that supernatural element or aspect of the show. But I do still think that there is an explanation for it all, which we'll talk about here in this review, especially with the conversation specifically that Danvers and Navarro actually has in the vehicle while they're driving away during one scene. They has this conversation where Navarro sort of takes that spiritual, supernatural side, and Danvers is a little more well grounded, and she's kind of like you don't really believe in that kind of stuff, do you, so to speak. She's more like she's like there has to be a logical explanation, and so basically Danvers is kind of just saying what we are thinking, or at least what I'm thinking. I guess I can't speak for everybody, but for me, that's how I think. I'm sort of what Danvers says is sort of, she's basically saying what I'm thinking. There has to be a logical explanation. But with that being said, we'll go ahead and jump into the review. If you do want to watch this episode with me or this full season, this season 4, you can do so over on our Patreon, and you can watch along with me over there. So the episode actually starts with 7 years ago, April 22. And as you can see, Navarro is here knocking on the door. Well, the episode opens with her knocking on the door, and she has her gun hauled out because she hears all this screaming inside, and so she's obviously going in to investigate it. She is an officer, so obviously she's going to be, very worried when she goes to this location and she hears a bunch of screaming. It also seems like to me that she was here with the intent of arresting someone because, just because of the way that the whole situation and the whole scene actually plays out. And when she bangs on the door, I believe this is actually Annie Kay. She ends up opening the door, and of course, Navarro has her gun pulled because she hears all of the screams. Now, the reason why I think that maybe, well, actually, we'll get into that in a second. So, when Anna obviously invites Navarro's in, and so she goes in and she discovers that all the screaming is caused by another young native woman who's actually giving birth, but they're doing it in the living room. And she's giving birth here in this, which I thought was pretty cool. She's giving a water birth here in this swimming pool, and it was just really cool to see that. Like, at least for me, that's not something. At least where I live, that's not a very common thing. That's not something you would see a whole lot of. Someone giving birth in like a little swimming pool here in the middle of your living room. So I just thought that scene was really cool, and I really liked that. And so Navarro's ends up coming in, and the person giving birth, the person in the pool actually asks, what's she doing here? And Anna actually looks at her and says, well, she's here to help. And that's exactly what Navarro does. She ends up staying there and she ends up helping out a little bit, passing Anna a few things, whenever she needs something or wants something. Navarro is sort of like, the gopher. She goes and gets it and brings it back. And then, of course, with the help of Annie Kay and, of course, Navarro's, the young lady ends up giving a successful birth, water birth, to a beautiful little baby. Now, they do have to do sort of like a CPR to some degree, almost like they have to resuscitate the baby a little bit, but they do, and the baby ends up being very healthy, ends up, it just ends up being this beautiful little ball of joy, and so she ends up having a successful birth. And so then we end up coming back to present day, and so now we end up learning that the date here now is December 22nd, which is now the 5th day of night. And I think by the time we get to the end of this episode, we'll learn that it's actually 6 days. I'm pretty sure when this episode ends, it actually ends up being December 23rd, but we'll get into that in a second. So anyways, here in the present day, Navarros ends up going and speaking to Hank. Hank is here. Hank is here, and he has all these very strange people with him. Danvers actually calls them. I think she's nicknames them like hillbillies or something like that, because these are all people that are not really any form of authority. They're not police officers. They really have no reason to even be there because this is an investigation. There's no reason for Hank to have all these people around who really don't have security clearance or any form of authority. But anyways, he does. He uses these people to basically pan out over the ice and go on this massive search. They're looking for someone. And what I thought was very interesting here was that Hank sort of gives a speech, telling them that they need to go find this person, but he never really, specifies the fact that they actually want to find this person alive, which is what Navarros actually points out. She's like, well, let's not forget that we want to take this guy in alive, and that once again sort of makes Hank very suspicious, and it's to somewhat very weird. I've sort of had a bad feeling about Hank right from episode 1, but I just kind of thought that maybe they were putting a lot of attention on him intentionally to make you feel like he's probably a bad guy just for the sake of throwing you off, so that maybe when it's revealed, whatever's really going on is actually revealed, then maybe you'd be like, oh, okay, well, it wasn't Hank the whole time. But by the time we get to the end of this episode, Hank really looks guilty, especially after an interview that Danvers and Navarros has later on with a certain, not really a suspect, I guess, but just someone, an informant, I guess, someone that they're going to talk about. So anyways, she looks at Hank and she's like, hey, let's not forget, we want to take this guy alive. So in the meantime, back at the precinct, Danvers and Peter are now here, and they're basically looking through everything, and and Peter is still sort of very much trying to figure out why is there this big tension between Danvers and Navarro, but he doesn't really say anything yet. They just open up the door, and we learn that there's actually 19 full boxes worth of evidence here, and so they ends up taking the evidence, and then they takes it out and brings it over to this other room, which seems to be a little bit bigger, but Danvers can't help herself. She knows that there's something on Peter's mind, so Danvers does what Danvers always does, and she just pretty well be straightforward with him, and she's just like, hey, whatever you got going on, just ask me, just ask the question, and I'll answer it, basically. And so he does. He asks her, what is the beef between you and Danvers? Why is there so much tension there? Why do you seem to hate her? And not between her and Navarro, sorry. And Danvers basically says it like it is. She says, she sits down with him and starts to explain and telling a story about a case that her and Navarro's worked on quite some time ago. And so she tells Peter basically that she doesn't actually hate Navarros. She just, sort of, it's almost like, it's not that they hate each other, but it's almost like, to me at least, how I feel about it after seeing the story and hearing the story and seeing the flashback, to me I feel like Danvers is probably just lost a little bit of respect for Navarro, because she ends up telling Peter this story, and when we actually see the flashback, she ends up telling Peter that her and Navarro's was working on a case about and she goes into great detail about this case, how they were investigating this guy who used to always keep beating up his girlfriend or his wife or whatever she was at that time, and Danvers does a great job at illustrating it and telling Peter that they knew they would eventually get the phone call, for this guy, eventually would end up killing his wife because of how abusive he was, and just how much of a idiot this guy is, basically. And she really goes into great detail illustrating it all. But what's very interesting is that when we actually see the flashback, it doesn't actually, it doesn't actually match up quite to what she tells Peter. Because she tells Peter that when they got the phone call to go and investigate this couple, once again, she tells Peter that by the time they got there, the girl was already dead, and the man had already shot himself and already killed himself by shooting himself. But when we actually see the flashback, what we see is we see Navarro's and Danvers coming in, and the man is still very much alive. And given the fact that we know that Navarro sort of had a very traumatic past. We know that her mother was mentally unstable. We know that her sister is very unstable, and we know that her herself, had a very bad relationship with her father. It seemed to be a very, rough, very, I guess, a very traumatic or even abusive situation that she was in growing up. And so, to me, I'm thinking that, and they don't actually confirm this here, but I'm thinking that once we eventually do see the full story, I have a feeling that we will learn that Navarro's probably actually shot him. I'd say when she went in here, just the trauma and everything that was after happening, plus working on all these other cases, plus we don't really know exactly maybe when this was lining up with Anna Kay, or maybe they did tell us and I just happened to miss it. But either way, you get what I'm saying. I think that it was a combination of a lot of things, of Navarro's past and combined with her trauma and combined with, being on the police force and just, having to keep going back to this person. This is a reoccurring offendant and whatnot, and so I feel like this was probably enough to trigger Navarro's into actually opening fire and shooting him. And I think that this is why Danvers actually told Peter that when they arrived on the scene, he had shot himself. I'm willing to bet that Navarro shot him, but Danvers is just, covering for her, which actually says a lot about their relationship, because despite the fact that everyone seems to think that Danvers hates Navarro's, it shows that even here, still all these years later, she's still covering for Navarro, and she's still, she has enough respect for Navarro to keep that story and to keep the cover story, and she's not blowing the roast on her. So, that does say a fair amount about Danvers as well. So I just thought it was really interesting, and I do think that that's the whole story will come out eventually. Maybe not publicly to the point where like Navarro's would actually lose her badge or get in trouble. I don't mean that way. I just mean that there's probably a good chance that we will see the whole story. This also parallels season 1 quite a bit as well, with Russ and his partner back then, when it was Woody Harrelson and Matthew McConaughey, when they were the two lead detectives. It was very similar. If you can remember, when they went to investigate someone, they end up, shooting and killing the guy, and once again, they both come up with this cover story, and they stick with it. So it's, so this season is very much paralleling the first season, and so I just thought it was worth mentioning that. And so then we go back to Navarro and her perspective, and she is now actually out on the ice, and I'm pretty sure she's still a part of that search party that is sort of being led by Hank, and so she's out on the ice. And once again, remember, we know that in her past, we know that her mother had mental, they had mental problems. She wasn't very stable mentally, along with her sister. We know her sister, is into a lot of stuff and has a lot of problems mentally. And so here, when Navarro's is out on the ice, she ends up hearing things, and even I think she probably even sees things, and she ends up taking this orange, which she took off Hank earlier, and she throws it into the dark and into the distance, and the orange ends up actually coming back to her. And so once again, this is sort of diving into that supernatural element, but once again, I do think that there's an explanation for it, which we'll get into later. And so she ends up basically going back and, actually she ends up getting a radio call, and when she gets the call, it's actually Danvers calling her back, because Danvers now wants her to go and help her go through all the investigation and basically relook at the investigation of Anna Kay, and go through all those 19 boxes that her and Peter was going through. And plus, I think that Peter is so young, and that he's so inexperienced, that she probably wants someone with a little more experience and someone with more of a keen eye. And so Navarro ends up going back, and we get, once again, a really cool shot here with all the evidence laid out on the floor. Just had this seems to be a shot that almost is reoccurring in this season. Almost every episode we have one shot with all the evidence laid out, and so I just thought it was a really cool shot. And so they start going through everything and looking at everything, and now that they're both looking through it all together, they both sort of ends up noticing something, which leads them to their next suspect, but the next informant, so to speak, someone that they're going to go and question to see if they can find out more information. And so they go there, and it turns out that this person is actually a hairstylist, or a hairdresser, I guess, really, and she's working what appears to be from her own home. She has a little girl and whatnot, and so Danvers ends up taking the little girl, and she goes out basically and makes almost something like craft dinner or something. Basically distracts the little girl while Navarro stays here questioning this woman. And so this is where we start to learn a little bit of information about Hank. And like I was saying before, I've always been a little suspicious of Hank, but it's just that it's so on the nose that it really made me wonder, like, is it really him? Could he really be involved? Just because of how much they're really pushing that. But it seems like maybe he is involved, because here, what we learn here in this interview is we learn that this woman actually did have information about Anna Kay and whatnot, and she actually did pass in the information, and she passed it along to Hank, but he never, basically did anything with it. He just sort of brushed it off and never did anything with it. Once again, making Hank look very, very suspicious. And this is something that neither one of them knew the whole time. Neither Danvers nor Navarros knew about this information, and none of them knew that Hank was ever told anything about the investigation. And so this obviously makes them, really question the loyalties of Hank. We already know that Hank is very suspicious as well, always asking Peter, sort of, he doesn't trust Peter. Peter obviously doesn't trust him too much, because he ended up stealing all those files for Danvers, so clearly he took Danvers' side over, over his own father, Hank. So, a lot of questions are being raised here now with Hank. And so on the car ride back, this is where we get a lot of really cool discussion and a lot of really cool back and forth between Danvers and Navarro's, where this is where they sort of have that speech where Navarro's is kind of like, questioning the supernatural realm, talking about how she would pray and how she does believe maybe that, the other side, the dead, could maybe communicate with us. And then Danvers is, taking the more realistic approach of it, and more so from the perspective of logistics, I guess. Not so much realistic, but more logistics. She's looking for an actual concrete explanation, where Navarro's is more like, well, it could be this, because she does believe in that spiritual ancestral side a little bit more than Danvers. But I think that makes it very compelling, because we have these two opposites, but yet they're still on the same team. So it's like two sides of the same coin, but one is approaching it from a more grounded, logistical, scientific way, whereas the other one is more spiritual and more open to the idea of the supernatural world. And so in the meantime, back at the skating rink, Hank ends up approaching Peter once again and brings him a bunch of skates, and basically starts to question him, wondering how close is Danvers, to this case, and how close are they to closing the case. Once again, making him look very suspicious and whatnot. And so while he's sort of here and prowling around Peter, Navarro's and Danvers ends up showing up again, and Navarro's really digs into him, starts saying everything about him, saying how he, basically obstructed an investigation. And he looks at Danvers and he's like, tame your dog, or whatever he says, like tame your deputy and whatnot. And so Danvers goes over and basically confronts him as well, and tells him that she should charge him with some form of like misdemeanor, or like I said, like some form of obstruction or something, because he held back information. And then he's like, well, maybe I should report you for doing whatever with her son, or with his son. And so she actually ends up throwing the coffee in his face. Once again, like I said, the image that Hank is painting for himself is not very good. He seems to be getting on the bad side now of both Danvers and Navarro's. Now, Navarro's is a little more fed up than Danvers is. She's kind of like, really, is that all you got to say? You're just telling them to back off. But of course, really, what can she do legally? But anyways, she ends up throwing the coffee in his face, and he ends up leaving anyways. And so once he leaves, Peter comes up with a pretty cool idea, actually, that I thought was pretty cool. And he tells Danvers that he knows someone who's a vet. Now, the whole reason why he came up with this idea is because they can't really do any post-mortem on the bodies yet, because they're still too frozen and whatnot. And also that I think Danvers is afraid that once the bodies are thawed out enough to the point where they could do like an autopsy and stuff, then the jurisdiction will be passed over to the other, to the Metropolitan Police, or whatever the other district is. So, so she's actually quite open to the idea of Peter calling in his friend who's only a veterinarian. So even though technically he's not someone who, he's not technically a real biological doctor, at least not for humans, he might, I think at this point she's just open to any ideas and open to all information from everybody. And so she basically agrees with this idea and tells Peter, yes, go ahead and call in your friend and see what he says and see what we can learn excuse me, about about these bodies, and see, what he thinks, just even if it's only a guess, just to see what he says about how they died. And so she's hanging out with him back at the skating rink, while Navarro's has gone out now continuing her investigation. And she ends up coming across this and finding this man who's very isolated. He's literally hiding out in like what appears to be like a fishing shack. And so she basically questions him, and he sort of gives her like an ultimatum. He's like, I'll give you some information about some things if you give me information about you. And he wants to know a little bit of information about her mother and whatnot, but she ends up complying. At first she doesn't, she leaves and she wants to walk away, but she ends up complying, and she comes back and she gives him a little bit of information, and then he gives her the information that she's looking for, because she's looking and trying to find somebody who she thinks, or maybe even knows, was connected to Anna, who might also be connected to this investigation, who was also connected to the Sila scientists, or whatever that was called, that research facility. So that's sort of why she complies. But you can tell that it bothers her a little bit. She doesn't really want to comply, but she does. Now, in the meantime, Danvers' stepdaughter, Leah, she ends up going out and about. Once again, she seems to be always out looking for trouble. But she's out hanging out with her young girlfriend, and she ends up going and actually participates in one of these protests. And as you can see, she has the lines on her chin again, which ended up making her mother very upset, in a previous episode, or her stepmother, but she's out here anyways, and she sort of gets involved with the protest, and you can tell that she's actually legitimately into it, because she starts chanting and whatnot, and you can really tell that she's really trying to embrace that native heritage. And of course, when she gets home, her mother is not happy about this and actually forces her to go and wipe off her chin to get rid of it all. But I don't think Danvers is doing this. Earlier in the series, I wasn't really sure how to take Danvers. I wasn't 100% sure if something happened to her, or if she ended up, having a really bad alteration with maybe someone who was indigenous or whatnot. But now, after seeing this episode, I think I'm starting to realize that she wants Leah to sort of, not seek out her the culture and whatnot, mainly I think for her safety, and I didn't really clue into that until I seen Danvers sitting down, and she's looking through the case, and she sees Anna Kay, and Anna Kay had those 3 lines on her, and I think that's why she's so against Leah doing this, is because she's really paranoid. I think that maybe, just maybe, something like this could happen to Leah. What happened to Anna Kay could easily happen to Leah, for many reasons. Like I said, Anna Kay used to be a part of the protests as well, and she too was very involved with the indigenous culture. And so I don't think that Danvers, doesn't want Leah to be happy, or doesn't want her to, experience or explore her heritage. I think she's just trying to keep her safe, first and foremost, even if it means, making herself look mean or bad. At least that's the vibe that I'm getting from it. And so, in the meantime, Navarro's ends up going back out again, out on the ice, and this time she actually hallucinates, and she does see someone which looks like a little child. I believe it is, maybe like holding on a teddy bear or something, and she goes to chase after it, and she actually falls bottom up, and she ends up hitting her head. But this time, when she rises up, she ends up rising into some form of hallucination, which is still kind of symbolic to the snow and the ice, except this time she's in the desert, and you can see in the background there's like this military truck, and she ends up talking to this little child, and that little child is holding onto a polar bear. So this, I think, I'm not 100% sure, but I feel like this is probably Danvers' child. As we know, or as we think, Danvers end up having a child who she end up losing. before she ended up getting the stepchild. So I'm guessing that the child she lost was her real child, whereas Leah is more of like her stepchild. And this, I think, also reflects back to the first episode when Rose was saying how the dead usually come for three reasons. They usually come, what was it? I think she said they either come to visit, or they come to leave something behind, or they come to take you with them. And so this is sort of the dead coming to leave something behind, because he gives Navarro's a message. He basically says, like, save my mom or something like that, or go get my mother or something like that. And so, this is clearly referring to Danvers. And so Navarro ends up gaining composure, and she ends up getting back up, and then she ends up getting a radio call about her sister, and her sister's not doing well, so she goes and checks on her. And so in terms of the supernatural stuff, I do think that this is probably Navarro's maybe she has something mentally going on, like her mother did, and plus we know her sister hears these voices and whatnot. So I'm thinking that Navarro could actually be just hallucinating herself, or maybe being very unstable because of the stress of the case and all that stuff, and having so much going on in her mind about Anna Kay. But anyway, she goes to her sister and helps her out. And so Peter at home now is also going through a bunch of troubles, because Peter and his girlfriend are starting to really go through a rough patch, because she's like, hey, she basically tells him when they first got together he wasn't a cop, and she's really starting to, really get angry, because she feels like he's always choosing his job over his family. He's always choosing Danvers over her, and she's very stressed out, always home taking care of the baby. She also has to go and do some exams early in the morning, and so I think that eventually, maybe in the next couple episodes, I'm thinking Peter will be forced to make a choice. He'll either have to choose his family or his job, and I do think that he'll choose the job first, because I just don't think he won't be able to. You know what I mean? I think he'll want to stay with Danvers, and I do think he'll want to see this case through no matter what happens. And so then we learn this is then when it goes to the next day, December 23rd, the 6th day of the night, and we see Danvers, and she's, at this place, and she's trying to wash her hands, and as you can see, the water is very black and very dirty, very contaminated. These people, unfortunately, are not able to drink the water, which we already knew anyways, which I think also could sort of be playing into the supernatural side of things. I think that this could be causing people to hallucinate, maybe it's, tricking their minds, who knows what kind of chemicals are in there. So it's definitely something from the mine, which is also why all the protests are going on. People are very angry with the fact that they can't drink their water, and that they can't, just have normal clean water. So, it makes sense that they will protest. So finally, Peter's friend comes, the vet, and he actually gives them a lot of really good information. He tells them that from his experience, now take that with a grain of salt, he is only used to animals and not people, but he does tell her that it appears that these people were very likely killed before they were brought out on the ice and not after, which means it's very likely that they did not freeze to death, but it's very likely that they actually were killed first and then dragged out on the ice, which kind of makes sense, because as we know that all the clothing and everything was folded, so it does make sense that maybe they were killed first. And Danvers asks him, what's his honest professional opinion? How does he think that they all died? And he says cardiac arrest. And so while they're there, Danvers ends up getting the phone call by Navarro's. And Navarro tells her that she has some information about another suspect that they can go and ask questions about, which is someone who did personally know Anna Kay. And so they go and question the guy, but the guy is very hostile, and he ends up pulling a gun on them, and they don't really get a whole lot of information out of him, other than the fact that it seems like he's not really fully aware that all of what happened with the research facility, or at the very least he's not really 100% aware of what happened to certain members of the research facility, but he does seem concerned about them. It seems like he probably has some form of connection to them and whatnot, but either way he's not very compliant, so he doesn't really go along go along with them all that much, and he does pull a gun on them and basically threatens them to leave before he shoots him. And so when they're on their way out, once they're leaving him, the hospital ends up calling and tells them that one of the research facility people, one of the researchers, the guys that ended up being induced into a coma, is now officially awake, and so they go and visit him. And as you can see, he's still very much in terror. You can see that it looks like he's gone blind. He's really suffering from heavy frostbite. He's also been amputated and whatnot, very much from the frostbite and everything. He's barely alive, and he's in a lot of pain. But he does tell them, he says, she's awake, she came for us, and he keeps saying that, he keeps saying, she came for us, she came for us, and this of course really puts a really heavy feeling on Navarro's, because she does believe in that more supernatural spiritual side. She do believe that they can communicate with the dead, and she right away thinks, at least, I mean, they don't ever say it, but to me it feels like she believes that he's talking about Anna Kay, and that she believes he's referring to Anna coming for them, which is possible. And if Anna is coming, then that would also go back to the reference of the first episode, when, once again, going back to when she said that the dead come for 3 reasons. Well, in this case, in the case of the facility, it would seem like Anna came to take them with her, because she wanted to come, and she wanted to get them, she wanted to have them killed, or get them killed, sorry. And so, and then while this happens, basically a riot or a brawl ends up breaking out in the hospital, which causes Danvers to have to go and break it up, and basically to, distill the situation. And while she's gone, the researcher, ends up sitting up straight and ends up calling out to Navarro's. And Navarro's goes in and he looks at her and he says, "Your mother wants you to know that she is waiting for you." And then as soon as he says that, he ends up going into what appears to be cardiac arrest, and from what I can tell, I don't think they're going to be able to save him, and I'm pretty sure that he ends up dying here. And then the very last part of the episode ends up ending with them basically looking into Anna Kay's cell phone, and there is a recording of Anna who actually ended up finding something. And it looks like she was in some form of ice cavern or something like that. And to me, the only thing I could think is that it's probably something to do with the mines or whatever. And that is basically where the episode ends, with them looking at the video of Anna finding whatever it is that she found, and then also she's screaming. And that's how the episode ends. So in terms of the supernatural stuff, what I think is going on there, I think it's just simply Navarro's I think that she is probably suffering from whatever it was that her mother had, and so I'm thinking that it's more of a mental thing as opposed to a literal thing. As to other people that are suffering from that, I think that it's very likely that it would be probably caused by the tap water. Maybe they all could be hallucinating because of the tap water, and plus the legend and whatnot. It's just, a lot of people just say, that's just the way it is here, we just see the dead and whatnot. So that's what I'm leaning more towards. I still think that there is a logical explanation for it, but it is still really cool to see True Detective go in that direction, and the story is really starting to pick up now. I really enjoyed this episode, even though there wasn't really a whole lot that actually happens. If you look at the episode as a whole, you don't really learn a whole lot, other than the fact that Hank is probably more suspicious than what he was, and other than the fact now that we've seen a video of Anna Kay and her finding something which I would assume ultimately led to her death, but it was, and whatnot. But I still think that I do still think that the supernatural side is very much a hallucination more so than something realistic, and I'm very curious to see where they go next with the story. And that's pretty well everything that happened in this episode. Like I said, my final thoughts are really not that much different than before, just because there wasn't really a whole lot of stuff that happened in this one. I still think that Hank probably is involved. I do think that Peter will end up choosing his job over his family, and I do think that we eventually will see the full story of what happened to that case between Navarro and Danvers. I do think that Navarro's probably killed that man, and then Danvers covered for it, and that's probably what happened between them to break the split. I think it was because she probably lost a little bit of respect, and maybe that's why she demoted her to a trooper. But I do think that bond will come back. I do think that she will forgive her and whatnot, and I'm also very curious to see what's going to happen now with Danvers' stepdaughter Leah. Seems like Leah is sort of following the footsteps of Anna Kay. You can see a lot of parallels there and all that good stuff. So it's going to be very exciting to see. There's only 3 episodes left. That was the mid-season finale, so it's going to be very curious to see where the show goes from here. And with that being said, folks, that's my review of episode 3 of season 4 of True Detective. Let me know in the comment section below if you've seen it, and if you'd like to tell me why or why not. If you like this video, click that subscribe button, and until the next one, take care.